Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Marcella McClatchy. I'm a program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on the Agricultural Development Team. BMGF is co-hosting this webinar series along with our partners at IITA. And today is day 2 of our 3-day webinar series on scaling agricultural innovations through commercialization, with a focus on food safety and nutrition technologies to support sustainable food systems transformation. The purpose of this webinar series, as you all likely know, is to really take a look at the pathway from innovations to impact, with a particular focus on how innovations are scaled through commercialization pathways and with support of the private sector. Yesterday was the first day of our series and really focused on setting the stage. So we took a look at 3 technologies in particular and did some deep dives on them. Those included Aflasafe, biofortified crops, and PICS. And today we're building on that work to take a more detailed look at the enabling environment that is needed to support these innovations to achieve scale. So that includes looking at the regulatory environment and standards, as well as the role of finance providers and innovative financing mechanisms. So today, the format will be pretty similar to yesterday. We will start with a keynote address. Well, actually, we'll start with a brief summary of the key findings and takeaways from our discussion yesterday, before going on to a keynote address and concluding with a panel of practitioners, of folks in government, folks in different financial institutions, to talk about some of these issues in more depth. So with that, I'd like to invite Dominic Schofield to go ahead and give us a summary of some of the key takeaways and highlights from our discussion yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcella, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone online. I will just load up my presentation now. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah.
How's that? Can you see yourselves on the screen? Or just the presentation?
Just the presentation, and then there's the panel on the side with the participants.
Okay, I'll get rid of that. So as you said, Marcella, thanks very much. I've been tasked to give a little bit of a refresh on yesterday's proceedings, but mainly to set up today. This is a refresh for those that participated. I think there were some 220 odd participants yesterday. And for those of you that were not able to participate, this should give you some of the key themes that we're building upon for today. As Marcella mentioned, we really focused in on the examples of Aflasafe, the Purdue Improved Crop Storage, PICS technologies, and biofortified staple crops as examples of experience in using a commercialization pathway for scaling. And we heard from some of the leaders involved in those technologies and developing them and in navigating the ecosystems that they've needed in order to make progress in scaling. But we've also heard from some of the private sector companies that are commercializing these innovations as well in different parts of the sub-Saharan Africa. And I thought perhaps that we could begin today just by pulling out some of the quotes that I think, judging from the chat box chatter that pursued these quotes, that really resonated with the group. And I think the first one I'm pulling up now was by Dr. DeShiel in opening the session yesterday, reflecting on the fact that the journeys of these technologies are already very well underway, and we have an opportunity to flip the story a bit, and rather than working from theory to practice, we have an opportunity in the next days to really reflect on our experiences and practice and shape theory. We also heard from Plummy from Kato Foods talking about the youth of his own organization and really motivating us all to just get started, take that first step. Don't be afraid, even if it seems like a daunting ambition. This really resonated, I think, with many of us. A bad system will defeat a good innovation every time. This idea that as we scale, we think about a systems approach, we think about the end game. But if that enabling environment isn't in place, if that ecosystem isn't working together to support that innovations journey, then that innovation won't survive. And we heard from Mark Schutt that we, in consequence, need to be prepared to kill our darlings, that not every innovation is going to see its way through. And we need to be able to reflect on the information and the data that we're receiving back from the environment, the feedback that we get from the environment, to be able to make the right kinds of informed choices. Another quote from Dr. Cooley was, "While one foot is on the accelerator, the other needs to stay on the brake." This idea that as we race forward to deliver, we need to stop and reflect at the same time. And really that this requires a discipline, but also acting in two minds as we approach scale. Oops, something's jammed here. Ah, yes, never miss a crisis. Was the idea that, particularly in recent experience with the pandemic and the pandemic response, there's an opportunity to take advantage of the urgency generated by that crisis to make progress. And a theme that came up over and over again was that this journey takes time. Some of the reflections were it could take 15 years to scale. In the example of PICS, we saw sort of first 7 years of building being encouraging, but a real explosion of growth in the following 7 years. So some of the lessons about the challenges that we discussed yesterday are here. I don't know why these bands are showing it. Can you see these bands as well? I'll try to move them out of the way as we speak. A desire for social impact and the convergence of some of the key social impact and environmental impact areas that we're most concerned about as we talked about these technologies really, I think, was sort of an underpinning of the whole conversation in that scaling up any ag tech innovation is complex. But really, we're moving into a much more complex arena when those ag tech innovations are focused on social impact, not just the immediate gratification of productivity, for example. We also heard from Shaya Shone in Ethiopia that the dynamics of challenges to sustain scaling can change. And so how do we sustain growth? I thought that was an interesting statement, because a lot of the conversation, of course, is how do we scale and then sustain that scale, as if there is an optimum scale that we reach and we hold. But really, from a business perspective, from a private sector perspective, it's sustaining the growth that is key motivator for them. And sequencing investments, timing these investments and building partnerships in a way that both follow a strategy to support this pathway, but also from a tactical perspective, what are we working with? What kind of resources do we have? What kind of capabilities do we have? And really using those as building blocks in a smart way. And I think a lot of the discussion yesterday described the individual experiences of those that have been successful in navigating the systems that they're operating in, often tactically. A major challenge that was raised was how to ensure that the value proposition for this innovation goes through the entire value chain, recognizing that agriculture and the food system is a business as much as it has social impact, and that the value proposition needs to be shared, that motivation needs to be shared by all actors influencing the pathway. Thomas Kehoe talked a lot about how the markets that we're working in are proposing to introduce these innovations and are a tough market to crack. And there are lots of structural factors that raise the perception of risk. So how do we share that risk? We heard often participants saying that we need to know our market. We need to design with scale in mind from the start. And we need to take a systems approach for scaling to make informed decisions based on feedback from the environment that we're working in, but also to use projects surgically to either fill gaps or introduce capabilities or to ultimately make that permanent change happen. All sectors and actors in this ecosystem have a role to play, but the question is, how do we engage them in a way that's meaningful? So really the question that we were discussing yesterday was really around, are we doing it right? Lots of questions about when to bring in the private sector. Should we have done it earlier? Did we wait until too late to get the government involved? Who else needs to be involved and when? And who is leading this? So sequencing became a main theme of the discussions, particularly in the breakout sessions. How to attract engagement of key players, in terms of private sector engagement, when and at what level. And although there was lots of discussion about government engagement, what do we mean by government? Who has the power to decide? Are we speaking to the right people within government? And are we engaging with the right champions and influencers? How do we know? All of this really pointed to, I think, teeing up today's session, which is a recognition that the right kinds of policies, regulations, and of course enforcing those regulations and incentives need to be in place in the system for the pathway of these technologies to progress towards scaling. We heard from Dr. Cooley this idea that the innovation and the delivery at scale can't really happen unless there's an intermediation role played. And although that was introduced, we didn't speak explicitly about it or develop that idea very much yesterday, but it was a powerful idea. And I think it's important to reflect on this idea that there's a role to play to facilitate the capabilities. But what are those capabilities that are required and at what time? And who delivers this intermediation function? Is it a project? Is it a coalition? Is it an entity? How does it evolve? Can we be more specific about what we need from an enabling environment? That's really the question that we hope to drive or channel the lessons learned that we discussed yesterday into the conversation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic. That was a great summary. So from here, we'd like to go into the keynote speech today. But first, I'd like to introduce our facilitator for today's events, Mr. Garen Hansen. Garen is the director of the Agriculture and Food Security Practice at Chemonics. And prior to his time at Chemonics, I had the pleasure of calling Garen a colleague when he was strategy officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on the agricultural development team. He played a key role in our markets portfolio and also the AflaSafe technology transfer and commercialization project. And the portfolio linked farmers to markets, tested innovative delivery models, and spurred private sector involvement in Africa. Prior to his time at the foundation, he was director of food analytics for FinTrack and agricultural trade team leader at the East Africa Trade and Investment Hub. He also spent 5 years in Rwanda, serving as a manager with the OTF group and Rwanda country director for the Wood Foundation. Garen holds an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and a BA in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. Thanks, Garen, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Marcella, for having me. And thank you, Dominic, for that great summary of yesterday's session. I think it sets us up really well for what we're hoping to discuss with today's panel. And so we have the pleasure of having a keynote speaker followed by 6 panelists, and I will introduce all of them. But I think first we will focus on the keynote speech. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonas Chianu, who is the head of the TAT program at the African Development Bank. And he has a long distinguished career as an agricultural economist, where he received a PhD from the University of Ibadan, had prior to his long experience at African Development Bank, worked at the CG Center. And he will be kind of kicking off today's session where, as described, we are really looking at beyond just the technologies created, what kind of policy environment or other enabling environment needs to be created for these technologies to be scaled. So really excited to look at a lineup of panelists from donor organizations, national governments, and international organizations. So Dr. Jonas Chanu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Garon. Will I have to share my screen for my presentation, or will it be, I sent it to the communications team at IITA, or do I have to share it? Do I have the right?
Yes, you have the right. Yeah.
I have the right?
Yeah.
Okay. Then, let's see it. Good. It is on the screen now. So, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. I don't know where you are coming from, but I really missed yesterday because I didn't participate in yesterday's meeting, but Dominic's summary was on the spot. So today I will be talking on the scaling of agricultural innovations through commercialization. I will be making this keynote presentation on behalf of my director, Dr. Martin Fregene. I'm Jonas Chanu. I'm a chief agricultural economist at the African Development Bank, and I coordinate the technologies for African agricultural technology, African agricultural transformation, which is being implemented in 37 African countries. Oh, how does it go? So the outline of my presentation will be, first, I will give some little background information. Then I will talk about agricultural innovation scaling in Africa. How is it occurring? And then I talk about the building blocks to scaling of agricultural innovations. And then I discuss policies and incentives that drive scaling of agricultural innovations. And then I will talk a little bit about those who play parts in the scaling of agricultural innovations in Africa, and then the challenges to agricultural innovation, and then the way forward. Now, why is the scaling of agricultural innovation critical in Africa? It is important if Africa will be ready to address the challenges it is facing in its food and agricultural systems, for it to become more resilient and also inclusive. As you may know, Sub-Saharan Africa is currently importing over 50 million tons of food, and it is projected to get to 1 trillion tons by 2030. The impact of COVID-19 on the food systems in Africa has been very, very severe. So scaling will help Africa to build that better. And of course, it will help to reduce the share of food that is accounted for by the small scale holders, while at the same time increasing the share that is accounted by medium to scale, large scale farmers. And this is an important trend that Africa needs if it will continue to satisfy the food needs of its population. Now, what do we already know about technologies and innovations reality in Africa? One thing that is sure, which we also found out from the TAT, is that the technologies are available, the innovations are available. In fact, under the auspices of TAT, we found out that Africa has more technologies now than Asia had, and Latin America had when they hit the Green Revolution. So a successful and sustainable scaling remains a challenge. And as Larry Kuhn has mentioned, only about 5% of the projects go to scale in terms of outcome. And probably this has something to do with the design of those projects. So what is happening is that the initial thin and informal market seems to persist due to lack of knowledge, due to lack of clear advantage of some of those innovations technologies over what has been. And of course, the fact that a lot of people being targeted are poor people who are a little bit risk averse. And of course, we don't need to expose them more in terms of risk. Now, successful scaling has happened to some extent, based on what we have even heard from Dominic this morning. But I just wanted to mention some of these key organizations that have done a great job, like we know about the Podo Peaks. We know about wheat in Sudan and Ethiopia under the auspices of TAT. And then what is important here is that the scaling up there has really made Sudan, for instance, to get to 85% of self-sufficiency in wheat production. And a similar thing has happened in Ethiopia. And when it comes to the TAT-S, which is where we are trying to build the poultry value chain by expanding in the savannas, maize and soybean production. But what is important here is that in Africa, we have 400 million hectares of savanna land, that if you can scale up maize and soybean technology, you are going to have enough maize and enough soybean for the poultry industry. Then we talk about the biofortified high iron bean and high zinc bean that is being scaled up under PABRA of SIAT. And then you have talked about the IITA's Aflatoxin that helps us to deal with the problems of aflatoxin. And of course, the whole lots of efforts that AGRA has been making, and also the World Bank under the World West Africa Agricultural Productivity and East Africa Agricultural Productivity efforts. Now, all these efforts, one thing that is clear is that the cash crop farmers are being reached more than the food crop farmers. So you can imagine the implication of that on Africa being able to satisfy its food needs. And when it comes to the size of operations, the large and medium scale farmers are being reached more than the small scale farmers. Now, the small scale farmers are disadvantaged in so many ways. They don't have access to finance. They don't have access to all the inputs they need. They don't have access to output markets. And of course, they pay higher prices for inputs because they are located in difficult to reach areas, and this amounts to high transaction costs. When you compare them with the large scale farmers, the large scale farmers are advantaged. They have access to good roads because they are located in some of the places where access is better, and they understand innovations better and faster. And that explains the higher adoption rate according to what we have heard from the work of the African Agricultural Technology Foundation in Kenya. Now, in agricultural innovations, how is it occurring? It has continued to linger. And it has been the case in many African countries and more in countries in fragile situations. The extent of progress and speed depends on coordination, effective partnership, resourcing, promotional effects, effective demand, enabling environment, and other supporting infrastructure required to boost commercialization. Now, projects, like we have all heard, has played a lot of important roles in the scaling. Then we talk of formal and informal extension, but of course, you know that formal extension was affected badly by the structural adjustment program of the early 1980s and early 1990s. Then, of course, the not-for-profit organizations like the CG centers are also playing a role. The private sector of late have also been playing a role when it comes to agriculture. Then farmer-to-farmer diffusion, community-based organizations, and the NGOs. True commercialization is the goal because it guarantees gain, profit as the driver. And it will lead to adequate innovation supply to demand. And food imports will reduce. And of course, food and nutrition security will improve. But one thing we know is that there is no such thing yet that is called pure commercial pathway to scaling. But moving forward, attention needs to be given to the private sector because they have to provide the critical coverage that we require to be able to scale faster. Now, experience from the African Agricultural Technology Foundation shows that once innovations are licensed to the private sector, they begin the journey that will eventually culminate in widespread commercialization. The pace of progress will depend on factors such as the size of the company, the capacity of the company, and also the resource endowment of the company. In Africa, it is noteworthy to know that most of the small and medium enterprises have limited resources, and this affects the reach they have when it comes to scaling. Now, some of the building blocks, we have heard that there is need for system-wide changes, but what I think is important is government, the private sector, they are very critical. Government has to provide supportive policies, the regulatory frameworks, the institutions that are critical in helping to make scaling less risky and more profitable, paving the way for the private sector to come in. Of course, the private sector participation is important because they have to play a critical role. So that brings me to the third bullet that talks about the importance of a joint effort between the public and the private when it comes to scaling. This cannot be avoided. It is critical. Then we have heard about intermediation. Intermediation is important because the intermediaries, they help to remove the choke points that forestall scaling. And then we talk about agricultural infrastructure and the supportive networks. They help to reduce the transaction cost and improve marketing efficiency. Then appropriate incentives, including smart subsidies, will guided to achieve the intended benefits, to elicit the interest of the private sector. And of course, functional and active agricultural extension. Now, catalytic finance is an important lever. And then, of course, market-based systems to expand the demand for innovations, and then technical assistance to help catalyze change related to scaling of agricultural innovations. Coordination is so important, and I believe that it has something, it's the same thing as what we talk of intermediation. But what I want to put here is our experience under the Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation. The TAT has 4 guiding principles: technology matters, scale matters, policy and regulatory environment matter, and then partnership matter. Scaling of innovations involve factors that go beyond what one actor sphere can muster. So there is need to join efforts to be able to make it happen. Now, we have talked about beneficial platforms, and all of them look like this intermediation we're talking about. And what I have in mind here is what we call the innovation platform. It has been very, very helpful under the auspices of that. And there, the stakeholders, they are now to be able to discuss and come up with what they call mutually beneficial services. And the strategic approach that will make us to make sure that even the scaling is put into consideration at the onset. And it is about concrete plans, business case for sustainable scaling. Now, if you look at all of these building blocks, they fall into what Gareth Shevley of Purdue University described as the scaling up triangle, consisting of the power of science and technology, the sustained and strong political will, and the policy environment. Now, policies that help to drive agricultural innovations include those that address bureaucratic requirements and permit commercialization, those that allow businesses to charge viable and sustainable prices for products devoid of the exploitation of the buyers, the consumers. Then those that allow relevant innovations to be moved across national and regional borders with the minimum tariff. Now, then you talk about harmonized frameworks, also that works like policies that allow movement of goods and services across borders, and then predictable policies that will allow people to make planning. Now, the incentives that drive scaling of agricultural innovations in Africa, and now I'm going to focus on the experience from the African Agricultural Technology Transfer Foundation. They are classified into 2 categories: the internal, which is innovation related, and then the external. The innovation related is about what we're talking about. The innovations must be real, and they have to have tangible solutions to the known challenges. They must be scalable, and they must be easy to multiply or replicate. This will ensure that the expected huge demand market for the innovation is met. They must be cost effective and ensure value for money. They must be profitable because that is the only way they can arouse and keep the interest of the different stakeholders. The external ones are outside the innovations themselves. And this is about access to different factors of production in terms of land, labor, management and capital, and then some of the targeted and well-intended subsidies. Now, who plays a role and who should play a role? Partnership and collaboration is key. And this must include the agriculture SMEs. They are critical, especially when properly and strategically constructed to address important gaps. The intermediate platform we have talked about, citing the innovation platform, can play an important role in linking projects to key players, partnerships, and financing, can facilitate learning and adaptive management critical for achieving broader systemic change and successful scaling. Participants in the IP innovation platform, they hold each other accountable. Then the public-private partnership that is critical because the government has to do something that is important to scaling, then it will now pave the way for the private sector to play its role. So the two of them joined together will make up an important progress. Now, there have been some people who have been doing a lot of advocacy in agricultural innovation in Africa. The African Development Bank is doing a great job also through that. The African Agricultural Technology Foundation, the World Bank through the IAP, and then the West African Agricultural Productivity, AGRA in its various programs in different countries, the Grow Africa, Odo University, Harvest Plus, and so on and so forth. Now, the key challenges that prevent many agricultural technologies and innovations from going to scale in Africa, that is the complete absence or inadequacy of the building blocks that we just talked about. And then these have been extensively discussed in earlier meetings, including the Podo conference that was held in 2018, September, the World Food Prize in Des Moines in 2018, the soft launch of the Scale Up source book in Washington, February 2019, then the formal launching of the Scale Up source book at the AGRF 2019, and of course the 2020 AGRF focused discussion on scaling that is talking about moving into action on scaling. The way forward. The already well-known barriers to scaling agricultural technologies and innovations must be systematically removed to pave way for significant adoption and creation of impact at scale. This is important for moving into action on scaling. Progress must be tracked based on clear scaling performance indicators. Challenges faced by the intermediate organizations, especially related to funding and organization, must be addressed, given their importance in agricultural innovation scaling. The cooperation, collaboration, and sharing of responsibilities required to usher in sustainable scaling of agricultural innovation must begin to concretely happen now. The approach in part through the RTDI. RTDI means Regional Technology Delivery Infrastructure. These are soft infrastructure, and it is about all the stakeholders that can make scaling to happen. Meetings alone cannot do this. Action is important. And then we have to, of course, avoid the temptation of scaling prematurely when all the important elements that will increase the chances of success are not in place. And this is, of course, compounded during the crisis like the COVID pandemic. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jonas. That was very interesting, and I think a great overview of the broad challenges to scaling from the perspective of multiple actors in the system. So I will take a moment to explain the format for the rest of the session. We will now turn to our 6 panelists, and I will briefly introduce each of them. And we have a series of questions prepared Some of you submitted questions when you registered, and so we have that list as well. But also feel free to put questions in the chat box on the side, and I will do my best to monitor the questions that are coming in. So we'll probably take 30, 45 minutes of targeted discussion with the panelists, and then we'll open the floor for your questions. So feel free to put them into the chat as they occur to you for either Jonas or for the panelists that I'm about to introduce. So with that said, I'm really excited about the 6 panelists we have here, representing really a few different groups of stakeholders. So we're very privileged to have 3 government officials working from the standards government side. We've got a representative from a donor finance institution, and then we have 2 representatives who I think kind of straddle the private sector policy world. So without further ado, I will start with our first panelist, Mrs. Ndidi Nwuneli, who's the managing partner of Sahel Consulting, which works across West Africa to shape agricultural policy, create catalytic ventures, and work on the ecosystem. But Ndidi also has founded quite a few organizations, which I think deepen her perspective on this topic from a few different angles. She's the co-founder of AACE Foods, which is sourcing directly from 10,000 smallholders. She's founded Leap Africa, which is equipping a new generation of young leaders in Africa. And she's also founded Nourishing Africa, which is a digital knowledge and data business, which focuses on helping agribusiness entrepreneurs scale. After that, we will have Rodrigo Ortiz, who runs the AgResults Agricultural Innovation Program. AgResults is a multilateral investment vehicle by donors that are testing pay-for-results solutions to agricultural market failures, and they've worked with several of the technologies that were discussed yesterday. Rodrigo himself has quite a bit of experience leading large and complex donor funded projects for the World Bank and USAID. So we can give that kind of donor perspective as well. After that, we have Mr. Peter Kaigwara, who is the Managing Director of the Kenya Bureau of Standards. We have Dr. Alex Dodu, the CEO of the Uganda Standards Authority. And then we have Dr. Rodwell Mzonde, who's the Director of Agricultural Planning Services in Malawi's Minister of Agriculture, all 3 of which have had, I think, experience working on standards and the regulatory side of commercializing some of the technologies we talked about and others. And then finally, we have Yosuke Katsuji, who's a Senior Investment Officer and the team lead for the East Africa Agribusiness Division at the International Finance Corporation. So has worked on investing in some of these. So quite a well-rounded panel, and I'm looking forward to speaking to each of them. I think we'll start off with a general question that anyone could weigh in on, but I'm particularly keen to get Ndidi and Rodrigo's perspective on this one. The technologies that we've discussed over the last couple of days, really do have pretty thin and informal markets when we first start off on the commercialization journey. So market-based solutions are not kind of the easy first solution for entrepreneurs or for organizations looking to commercialize. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience developing market systems, working with institutions, and working on the enabling environment to support commercialization. So maybe Ndidi, I'll let you start off with that one.
Thank you so much, Karen, and it's a pleasure to be here. I was really smiling from ear to ear as Dominic was speaking and as a previous speaker was speaking, because I spent the last 1.5 years working on a book which will be published this month called Food Entrepreneurs in Africa, Scaling Resilient Agriculture Businesses. And I interviewed over 80 entrepreneurs who are scaling in Africa, as well as research institutions, funders, and came up with a model which I think answers your question. That for technologies to scale and for businesses to scale on the African continent, they need 6 things. And some of these were captured by Dominic, but not all. First, demand-driven interventions with measurable value addition. And this is so critical, especially when we think about new technologies. If it's not demand-driven, then how do you prove the demand, especially to the smallholder farmer who has limited income? How do you generate demand? And how do you demonstrate this measurable value addition? The second is that you have to leverage data and innovation. And the users have to understand how to leverage technology in a way that eases their cost of doing business, eases the cost of operations, links them with new markets. Or there has to be something that this technology, data, and innovation demonstrates. The third is that businesses that scale shape their ecosystem. So where there are no policies that support what they do, they create these policies. They're involved in creating that enabling environment. They don't wait for it to happen. The fourth is that they leverage cost-efficient and dynamic systems and structures. The fifth is the simple, compelling branding, which tells the story of the innovations, tells the story of the entrepreneurs, tells the story of the commercialization. And finally, but most importantly, and if anything COVID-19 has shown us, is that these interventions have to adapt to climate change. They have to be agile. They have to mitigate risks and adapt to shocks. And from this business model, these 6 key components, what I realized, especially with technology, is that where you have very weak ecosystems, very weak processes for transferring, in many of our countries, weak extension services, no formal distribution mechanisms, you have to create them. And that is costly, it takes time, but creating that means that you're essentially building a quasi-private public partnership to deliver. And through Sahel, some of you know, we work with basics. There's an IITA-led intervention in the cassava seed systems. We're working with YISWA, which is a yam seed systems intervention. And then we're also working with dairy, the Advancing Local Dairy Development Project in Nigeria. And all of these are leveraging innovation and technology and are trying to commercialize. And we've seen that the only way to do this is an ecosystem approach that leverages unusual partners and also builds a supply and distribution channel to ensure that not only do you prove impact, but also build for sustainability.
Great, that's really interesting. Rodrigo, as Ndidi was speaking, her first point in that kind of 6-piece model about proving demand really made me think of AgResults and thinking of your experience trying to commercialize AflaSafe and trying innovative ways to prove demand where that may not always be obvious to smallholders that it's a product they want to pay for without an immediate return. So maybe you could explain a little bit about AgResults as a project, and then talk about that example of AflaSafe in northern Nigeria and how kind of innovative market-making technologies were tried and some of the lessons learned there.
Great, thank you, Garen. Good evening or morning to everyone. I'm delighted to be here talking about AgResults. AgResults is an initiative that essentially uses pay-for-results to competitions to incentivize the private sector to invest in high-impact agricultural innovations. Now, we do this to achieve several goals: reducing food insecurity, improving household nutrition and health, and increasing livestock productivity. Now, our underlying theory of change rests on that if the private sector is appropriately incentivized, they can, first of all, identify and source new technologies. Secondly, they can incentivize the private sector to overcome these market barriers that come up. And this will achieve wide-scale adoption and scaling, and hopefully create a sustainable market. Now, the reason we use prizes is, number one, because prize competitions offer a unique value add over traditional push or grant funding. It heightens awareness. It creates an opportunity to inform, inspire, and mobilize otherwise neglected issues. Probably our brucellosis vaccine prize is a good example. It's a disease that is predominant, that is very important, yet it's neglected because there's other opportunity costs in other vaccine projects. Secondly, we pay only based on results. If we don't get results, then there is no payment, and we can reprogram the funding. Third, it spurs the private sector into market action. We use solution agnostic competition. So the private sector has the leeway to develop whatever solution they think is best and that suits their individual business practices. And then we feel that it stimulates innovation into new areas, providing various paths to success. Now, price competitions can also create an enabling environment that drives up scale and agricultural technologies to make market systems more sustainable and resilient. Now, how does this work in these thin markets, as Garen mentioned? Okay, in the first case, we use monetary incentives to stimulate the initial demand. Second, we show competitors that there is potential for expanding their business models and networks to scale these agricultural technologies. Now, in the first case, we're working around the area of sustainability. The prizes motivate the private sector to adopt new ways to solve existing problems. Over time, that adoption moves into adaption, where they adapt current business models and create new partnerships that will help sustain and maintain that sustainability. In the second part of the equation is achieving scale. As the economic benefits of technology emerge, a broader market landscape shifts and expands to strengthen the relationships. Over time, this eventually produces a response to the changing markets, transforming the entire market into a market system that's sustainable and resilient. Now, in the case that Garen had mentioned, let's say of Nigeria, the problem was a high prevalence of aflatoxins in maize produced that had toxins or that were carcinogenic. And this was associated with childhood stunting. So we developed a 12.6 million prize competition to incentivize private sector aggregators and grain traders to work with smallholders to adopt AflaSafe and improve the quality of maize. So we offered a prize of $18.75 per metric ton of maize that was aggregated that had over a 70% prevalence of AflaSafe. Okay. Now the initial hypothesis in Nigeria was, would the provision of AflaSafe and inputs improve yield and produce aflatoxin-reduced maize? Secondly, was there demand in human, poultry, and swine markets for this maize? And would a price differential eventually develop in the market? And then the third interesting variation of the hypothesis was, in the fifth year, would interest continue if we reduce the price by 50%? Okay, so the private sector was very cautious, as you know, smallholder farmers and especially smaller businesses in Africa are very cautious about their cash flow. They move very slowly and cautiously. So it took competitors and their associated farmers from 1 to 2 years to start up and test the product and develop confidence in its use. Access to finance was critical because it was limited. So for some competitors, this delayed their scaling because they weren't credit worthy. Now, by reinvesting the prizes and the profits that they obtained, they were slowly able to scale. And in some cases, organically, they were able to, once they achieved sufficient volume, then the banks started considering them as credit worthy. So the scale up of delivery required also competitors to develop training and consolidation networks to make this happen. We used a pay-for-results competition model. We used incentives that shaped the competitor behavior. We produced shifts in the business models around producing a premium product. There had never been a premium product of this type in Nigeria. Maize was maize. And so all of a sudden we were pushing through these aggregators to develop a premium market of aflatoxin-reduced maize. Maize that was guaranteed and tested to be of a low aflatoxin content that could be used in baby food, it could use in human consumption, swine and poultry and other things where aflatoxin toxicity was particularly sensitive. And then we started creating a more supportive, enabling environment to this. Eventually, there was the commercialization of aflatoxin to produce the high quality maize. The IITA handed it over to private enterprise. Distribution networks were developed. Some aggregators grew to be larger and larger. The smallholder farmers started trusting more and more in the aggregation process. Some of the access to finance issues started resolving themselves. And the end result is that we had market recognition of a product and with nutritional value that was accepted by government, private sector, and the consumers, and a sustainable market that was developed with a price differential. There was about a 13% price differential between regular maize and aflatoxin-reduced maize. In total, we produced 213,000 metric tons of this aggregated maize, and we reached almost 76,000 farmers.
Great. Thank you, Rodrigo. I know it's quite a complicated project, and I think you did a good job of summarizing the main takeaways. My next question for the panel, I'd love to hear first from our government representatives, but really understanding what role governments have in creating an enabling environment for technology commercialization. And particularly, what do you feel like is working from your experience, and how are you measuring the progress in enabling environment gains for ag technology? So I'll start first with Peter to talk a little bit about Kenya, and then we'll move on. Seems, Peter, are you there? All right, well, we can move on to Alex then to talk a bit about Ghana.
Thank you. This is Alex Dodu from Ghana. Thanks for the question. And you asked a question about how technological adaptation is taking place and how we are measuring progress.
Yes.
I will give a Ghana-specific example. So the government of Ghana since 2017 has put agriculture at the forefront of its development programs. So the government came up with flagship programs. One is called the Planting for Food and Jobs. One is the One District, One Factory, which takes into account the fact that every administrative district in Ghana has products that can be commercialized. Now, linked to that, we also had the basically agricultural for rural development. It's called the Planting for Export and Rural Development. So the key things are, one, agric with the aim of making money, of the aim of exporting, of the aim of meeting the demands of the market. So whether it's planting for food and jobs, planting for exports and rural development, or our One District, One Factory program, the fundamental underpinnings is that we really want to move into an industrial agricultural space. So government has done all these. Government has supplied free fertilizer. Government has given training, extension officers. But then the reality is that the market works to a standard. The market works to a requirement. So government let the technical agencies, and in this place, I'll mention the Ghana Standards Authority and Ghana's Food and Drugs Authority. And I'll mention our role later. But as part of the government strategy in measuring impact, the government set up a web portal called Development Tracker. where government has listed the initiatives government is undertaking and has given the stages each initiative has reached. Now, obviously, that is more or less a line listing of activities rather than giving the meat of it. Though for some projects you can get down. So one, the government of Ghana is very keen to be able to prove that the investments it's making are yielding the desired impacts. Now, this is a government which has made it a priority to digitize. So we are digitizing all activities. However, and this is where the issue of technological commercialization comes in. Despite all the numbers, it's quite difficult to link just the technological innovations leading to the excess food production or the excess for exports. We need to develop metrics to measure how specific interventions are leading to the outcomes we are seeing, because it's been a mixed bag. Free fertilizer, extension officers, reduction of imports through a few strategies. So really, the question is, what or which of the specific interventions are leading to progress? Specifically on aflatoxins, the GSA took on the AflaSafe project purely because we noticed that our key exports, one is maize. Ghana cannot export maize to several countries because the aflatoxins level are beyond what would be accepted in Europe. So our major companies, Unilever and Nestle, are importing maize when we are a net exporter of maize to West Africa. So there is a disconnect. So Ghana's Standards Authority and the Food and Drugs Authority are ensuring that all the food standards are converted into technical regulations which are enforceable. Now, we have had rejects, especially from the European Union, of too many products. And thankfully, we've noticed that it's going to be an all-inclusive approach, as in Ghana's Export Promotion Authority, the Ministry of Agri, the Food and Drugs Authority, the Standards Authority, and the Association of Ghana Industries. We've created a team to ask, how do we solve this problem? The end game being that we want to improve exports, and we want the exports not to be rejected. And we have, at least at the beginning, created an information sharing platform. But I think it will take more. And we are shadowing the discussions ongoing and learning some of the lessons here, that all the farmer or the businessman wants is that they get profits from their investments. How can government, through its various agencies, ensure that that happens in a seamless manner, rather than the typical situation where you go to 10 government agencies to get one export to get its intended destination? I would hold on for now, but I'm happy to answer further questions.
Great, thank you, Alex. Very interesting. I would ask Rodwell from Malawi the same question. So what is the experience in Malawi? What concrete actions are you all taking to create an enabling environment, and what's going well, and how are you measuring progress?
Oh, can I have my video on?
There should be a button in the lower left corner of your screen, if you see that, to start video.
Yeah, I am trying to start, but it's saying that the host has stopped it.
Okay, well, perhaps IITA Communications can work on that, and you can start talking while they look at the video. I hear you clearly, so you can go ahead and speak.
Yeah, in Malawi, we have got a lot of interventions to bring technology to the required customers. For example, we have to relax some policy issues, regulatory issues. I'll take you, for example, in the effort to increase the productivity and the export abilities in Malawi. We have had problems in gaps in supplying the food, and that affected nutrition in the country. And the government started to bring in some incentives to make sure that our farmers or farming community should take up new technologies so that they can increase productivity and production of their crops. We have had the approach of having the affordable input program in Malawi, whereby this year, for example, we had to provide subsidized fertilizer and seed to the farmers, and we reached out to 3.7 million farming households. That alone is not enough because we are experiencing most likely the surplus in the production. And we are also saying that what will happen to this? Can we have this locally consumed, or we are to have this sent on the export market? So we are also in the drive of getting the private sector involved in the export of the maize. As I'm talking, we have 1.1 million kilograms, million metric tons surplus of maize, for example. So we are planning that we do the export, and we have got a number of destinations for that. We are likely to involve our private sector because the policy has it that the private sector is also to play a role. At the same time, even government, enterprises are also to play a role to create a competition on the local market because of that. This is just one of the examples which we have done. But of course, maybe I can talk later. Another example is on the biofortification of some food crops. We have been in partnership with private sector in production and selling these fortified or biofortified crops in Malawi. We have had the relaxation on the price control, as it were, due to liberalization of the market in Malawi. And we have had also to bear some costs of breeding these biofortified crops. So, you know, if you don't take some research costs on, definitely the private sector cannot come in because of the high risks involved in the research activities. But as I'm talking now, the private sector, for example, seed companies are there to produce and sell seed through agro dealers in Malawi to farmers. And then farmers, because sometimes they produce a lot, they also have to sell this to processors as well as millers, so that the products to be made should be on the market in an improved form or high quality products. So in Malawi, we have got these good regulatory frameworks as well as policies to make sure that the transfer of technology is to be possible, because we know that without change, we cannot go anywhere. I think I should stop there.
Great. Yeah, very helpful and good examples, Rodwell. I see that Peter is back in the room, so I want to lob that same question to him that I asked his colleagues from Ghana and Malawi, Peter, on what is going well on the Kenya experience for creating an enabling environment, and how are you measuring progress of those strategies that you're finding particularly effective?
Okay, thank you very much. My apologies for that small hitch. I'm just a small clarification also. I'm the Director Market Surveillance for Kenya Bureau of Standards, not the Managing Director. Thank you, Garen. Otherwise, we've had a challenge concerning aflatoxin in the finished product and also along the value chain. And what we have done is we have formed a agency or multidisciplinary team comprising of various government agencies, and also collaborating, also reaching out to the private sector. And one of the issues we've realized is that for us at Kenya Bureau of Standards, we are responsible for the finished products. That's where we are responsible for doing market surveillance to establish the quality of the product that is going to the consumer. So we realized as government agencies that we need a holistic approach in order to curb the issue of aflatoxin in finished products and also in the raw materials. So what we did, we formed a team that is going to that has been looking at interventions from farm level to post-harvest handling, including where applicable there are issues of importation and the processes during production of finished product, maize meal. And so we've developed intervention measures from the raw materials, also looking at the testing capability along the whole value chain to be able to look at what are the issues which can contribute to have an early detection system to be able to detect factors which can contribute to aflatoxin contamination, and also be able to arrest any aflatoxin. So the intervention measures along the whole value chain, and some of the from the farm produce, we're looking at the issues of the use of Aflasafe, and this has been one of the solutions which have been proposed among other technologies to help in terms of curbing this aflatoxin menace. So when you look at well, so the proposed intervention measures will also provide opportunities for adoption of suitable technologies. So in terms of storage, in terms of post-harvest handling, and so on and so forth. So the proposed policy measures, which we have been working on, will also have a monitoring and evaluation of the whole process to establish whether the intervention measures are successful or whether they are bearing fruit. So we are at the tail end of finalizing the policy intervention measures and developing a budget along the whole value chain. And once it is done, then we've come up with a budget that will be able to handle all these issues. So this will provide an opportunity for the entry of the private sector to come in order to help arrest or contain this situation. I think that would be what I will have to say for now. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. Very, very helpful. I'd like to ask kind of a similar version of that question to Yosuke, representing the IFC, an organization that both invests in technologies and companies, but also works on enabling environment issues, and kind of get your perspective on the role that organizations like IFC can play in creating an enabling environment, how you measure progress, and what's working.
Okay, thank you, Garon. So yeah, so right, so we are trying to be as active as possible in this area, and as Dr. Jonas mentioned, so we provide financing, but on top of it, we think it's very important to provide technical assistance, advisory services to the farmers and ecosystem as well. And then, as Ndidi said, I mean, really high touch model as close as possible to the farmers, and really, working with the right channel, kind of a choke point where, really lots of farmers could gather, or, where the choke point where that has access to farmer, that would be the key. And maybe I'll give you like 4 examples of areas that we're working on. So one is financing actually input companies and ag tech. So for example, we invested in Apil, which is like a plant-based coating to extend shelf life of fruits. So, and then also we invested in Maiko, which is Indian company who produce improved cotton seed, and then they're pretty active in Africa as well. And then second bucket is, invest in aggregator and then work along their supply chain to, provide technical assistance to the farmers. And then, so the example is we invested in Souffle, barley malting company in Ethiopia. And then we are providing technical assistance to their supplier farmers. So, working so that farmer could get better input, or, providing training on farming as business, as well as like irrigation and soil management training. And we worked with about 40,000 smallholders, and lots of them, they doubled the yield. So it's really step-by-step effort, but it's pretty effective because we invest in off-taker and then try to support farmer along that supply chain. And the third example is on the livestock side. So on so I don't know if you heard about dual purpose poultry, but we're joining hands with Gates Foundation and Ethio Chicken in Ethiopia. So this is like a, kind of a breed that doesn't really need like an intensive feeding. So the bird could basically scavenger, but produce like higher egg production, productivity. And then at the end of the cycle, you sell the bird as meat, right? And then you can back calculate from, festive season or when meat demand shoots up, right, at the Christmas or Easter or whatever, and then grow the chicken. And meanwhile, you get like a egg as, nutrition source or income source. So we are working to strengthen. So for this one, like for this kind of a new breed dissemination, village agent is key, where, the agent will grow from day-old chick to like a 21-day-old chick. So like a highest disease risk point is over. And then, the agent can on-sell to the small farmers, right? So we're working with, stakeholders to strengthen that network and capacity of village level, grower agents. And the last example is developing like a medium scale farms in Kenya, partnering with the KCB Bank and Twiga Foods. And the reason we're trying to, do medium scale farms. So in addition to smallholder, we think like so there's a bit of missing middle, no? So there's half hectare smallholder, and there's like thousands of hectare of large plantation, and there's a bit of missing middle where you have like a 10 hectare, 20 hectare. And I'm a son of a farmer in Japan, and we know if you have a 10 hectare, it kind of starts as a business, and mechanization would start to make sense. So, and we believe like on top of smallholder base, if there are those cluster of like a medium scale farmers, they could serve as natural demo farms, or when new technology come in, medium scale farmers could adopt, and then that will naturally disseminate to surrounding smallholders. So we're structuring as Twiga as off-taker, and then Twiga is providing actually agronomy assistance to those emerging medium scale farmers. And then with KCB, we're trying to finance few hundreds of those 10 hectare, 20 hectare, horticulture farms that are emerging in Kenya. So those are like bits and pieces of our effort we're trying to do in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, great, really interesting. And I think that point about finding the right entry point and the right type of farm to commercialize technology is a really important one that sometimes gets overlooked when we're really just focusing on the poorest of the poor. Understanding kind of the farm economics is quite important at all levels. So point well taken. I think now I'll turn to kind of a round of targeted questions for each panelist, one by one, and then we can open it up for questions to the group. So First, Ndidi, I'd like to go back to you. And something you said about in your six-step model for entrepreneurs really kind of piques my interest about businesses shaping the enabling environment. And I think that is something that we've seen work when there needs to be the right platform for dialogue between business and government, and giving businesses that opportunity to shape enabling environments for what issues matter to them. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that, either from your own experience or maybe through some of these entrepreneurs you interviewed for your book around how business can shape an enabling environment and what the proper role is for advocacy there.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to pick up on one of our projects. It's called Advancing Local Dairy Development in Nigeria. And we're working in 5 states, basically linking smallholder dairy farmers to milk processors who make yogurt and packaged milk. And what we realized very early on when we did the pilot in 2 states before we expanded to 5 states was that if we didn't involve policymakers from the beginning, we're almost creating a project that's not sustainable and going to fail. Because importing milk is much cheaper and easier for many processors than sourcing locally. And so through this project, we created a National Advisory Council, which has ecosystem players. So not just players from the Ministry of Agriculture, but players from gender, trade and investment, finance, the central bank. And this is critical. You need to have ecosystem policymakers involved in this discussion, because across the board, for every value chain we work in, if you only focus on increasing productivity or increasing adoption, but you don't address tariff issues, you don't address tax issues, financing issues, you're setting yourself up for failure. So we have gotten all these ecosystem players aligned in the importance of protecting the Nigerian players and making Nigerian milk more competitive so that we displace imports. And we've done this at the federal level and at the state levels. And so for me, a key takeaway from this engagement is if policy is going to be shaped, it has to be ecosystem focused, it has to involve unusual suspects, and it has to be done at the federal level and at the state level. The second thing is the importance of data. And if you don't have data to drive data-driven policy making, you're going to struggle as an entrepreneur or even as an implementer, an intermediary, a research institution that's trying to drive demand. We really need more data that's collected, even for this Aflasafe movement. If you don't have data that shows usage, adoption, risks associated with the lack of Aflasafe maize, the cancer rates that aflatoxin drives, or whatever it is, you will not be able to make a case for sustained demand. And then the third thing we've seen through our work, and we are collecting this data, generating the data, sharing it every week. Every week, I share a newsletter with all the central bank officials, everybody in all our ecosystem, to show them what is happening in the dairy sector and what changes are being made. And this is being replicated in other ecosystems. And then the last thing I'll say is it's really important to build a network of champions. And we need these champions who are in the media, and partnerships with the media is critical. We need champions in trade associations, industry associations, and across the board, we need influencers who understand the work we're doing and can speak the language. And I just want to point out that what I've seen is that where you don't have those 3, policy enablers, ecosystem approach, where you don't have data, where you don't have champions, you're going to struggle, because at the end of the day, there's no demand. And for Aflasafe, and a lot of the examples are about Aflasafe, so I just want to touch on it. All the private companies that I work with who are at the processing end of it say that consumers are not willing to pay a premium for Aflasafe maize or for products that use Aflasafe maize. And that limits demand. And I'm sure all of you will agree with me that that's an issue. And so if you don't affect consumer behavior and educate consumers about the risk of aflatoxin consumption, then they will not demand it. And then it will flow all the way down to the seeds. And so regardless of all the interventions or donor funding that we pump into this, it's not going to change the ecosystem. For sustainability, we need to ensure that the consumer is also carried along, and that a lot of our messaging and engagement is value chain wide as opposed to siloed. Thank you.
Thanks, Ndidi. Really great points. I would like to turn to Rodrigo, and I think you gave some interesting examples from the Aflatoxin experience that I think line up with what Ndidi was just saying. Working with one piece of the ecosystem with the private sector, but then talking about the enabling environment considerations the project had to make in Nigeria, and also in the very, I think, diverse context in which the project has worked with really different enabling environments for the kind of crops or challenges you're trying to solve. So it'd be great to hear from you a little bit of the non-market lessons you've learned and how your market interventions interact with enabling environments in relevant context.
Thanks, Karen. Well, I could cite two interesting examples of where a donor program like ours can contribute to that governmental enabling environment. For instance, when we started working with aflatoxin in Nigeria, there wasn't really an adequate testing system. Testing was very expensive. We had to develop a DNA sequencing test that eventually was handed over to the government. So that's made that testing much easier and more efficient. In the case of Kenya, for instance, where we're working with hermetic bags, there was no standard in existence for hermetic bags. The Kenya Bureau of Standards hadn't developed it yet. It was a relatively new technology. And some competitors were selling LGB, large grain bore proof bags. So there was really no testing system in place to evaluate those bags and certify them as being LGB proof or not. So we developed these systems. We used universities and experts, and once these protocols were developed, these were also handed over. Now, what Ndidi was saying before, we feel that food safety and nutritional benefits must be clear to the competitors, but in particular to the consumers. And that's a big task. Most projects don't have enough advertising and dissemination to create that consumer awareness. And that market awareness is necessary to allow for the uptake and growth and future demand. Now, it's very interesting in our case, since our projects go in for, let's say, 4 or 5 year period, we normally don't have the time to wait for substantive improvements in the investment, in the operating environment. So what we try to identify is the absence of barriers, the absence of limiting factors. So for instance, if you're working in maize, this is a crop that can be highly politicized. In Zambia, for instance, where you can have price controls, export controls, where you can have distortions in the market, and where it'll make it almost impossible to operate. So in the case of Nigeria, we were very fortunate. There wasn't that disenabling environment, but we're also lucky. The government could have, for X or Y reason, because there was a deficit, they could have imported maize from other countries, and that would have had a negative effect on the project. So we spend a lot of time now looking at, is there anything in the environment that would limit our private sector growth and innovation? And then as we move forward, like in Nigeria, we started working to develop the testing system, the standards, and the adoption in the medium term that would then contribute to the enabling environment.
Great. Thanks, Rodrigo. I'd like to turn to Peter now and ask, kind of playing off some of what Rodrigo mentioned in terms of standard development and interacting with the private sector, particularly around aflatoxin in maize and peanuts there. What are the challenges going forward, and what are kind of KEB's or Government of Kenya's priorities for kind of next steps in action?
Okay, thank you very much. I think the biggest challenge is the supply of raw materials, the availability of raw materials that that is an input in the processing of the various products from groundnuts to maize meal, which end up to be consumed. So for us, the greatest challenge and probably we need greatest intervention measures is the supply of raw materials. And this goes to what are the agricultural practices of the farmers so that they can be able to produce and supply quality products. So sometimes we import some of these raw materials. Are there sufficient checks when the products are coming into the country to be able to curb entry, or rather to be able to ensure that whatever is reaching the manufacturers is of the right quality. So those are some of the challenges and where we need a lot of intervention measures. So we need a lot of farmer education in order to help them to adopt the right practices, to use the right technologies to ensure that whatever they are producing is safe. We also need the testing capacity. We need to increase the testing capacity along the whole value chain, like maybe moisture content at farm level and aflatoxin testing kits. So these are some of the proposals that we have come up with to be able to ensure that what is being supplied to them is safe. So we are also looking at the technologies for storage to ensure that they are right. The technologies for transportation. One area is are they the right equipment for transportation? And we are looking at having a grain code for transportation to ensure that you see the product may leave when it is okay from the farm, but by the time it reaches the manufacturers or where it's being used, it's not in the right condition, or maybe it's being affected by poor transport or storage conditions. So these are areas we are looking at providing intervention measures. We have, in that proposal, we've come up, as I mentioned, with a whole budget, and also we are looking at partnering with the private sector or with other partners to be able to fund the various intervention measures. As I mentioned, it's something that requires a whole value chain approach, not just looking at the tail end of the market. Thank you very much. I hope I've been able to respond. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. I'll turn to Alex now. I think several of the panelists have talked about the importance of education, whether that be farmers on practices or consumers to make sure the system is working. I know Ghana, driven in part by some export bans and for other reasons, has embarked on some educational campaigns. So we'd love to hear from you on the successes and challenges of that status and next steps.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So Ghana has had challenges with aflatoxins in relation to ban on exports. Thankfully, with funding from IITA, we started the National Aflatoxin Sensitization and Management Project, which basically was an educational and awareness creation project. We started from the lowest of the low, went through all the administrative regions, met farmers, in all over 10,000 individual farmers, ascertained their knowledge of aflatoxin, the impacts, and how to manage them. We had, t-shirts to attract them to come for the meetings. We had simple one-page leaflets. We had pictorial materials. And the first thing was that they were shocked at the negative impacts of aflatoxins and of how prevalent aflatoxins were in most of the products they consumed. We also introduced them to the technologies available, which were AflaSafe. We got some collaboration from the Mexican embassy So we did speak about nixtamalization. We explained to them the storage facilities, and in a few areas provided them with moisture meters. What we realized was that, one, working with farmer groups at the bottom level is the only way to start, since most of our produce are bought from aggregators who start from the farm. So if we leave the farm gates, everything we do is lost. The project, it was a $250,000 project. Basically, the demand for the work was more than we could achieve. We had TV programs in local languages. So the demand was huge, but the purse was limited. And indeed, it's one of the few projects which went ahead of time and ran out of budget. But there were tens of newspaper articles, articles in the media and radio stations. And it's actually impacting on policy already. In Ghana, we have a national steering committee for aflatoxin control, including government agencies, research organizations, and the private sector. And this has bumped up the issue of aflatoxin control very high. Then there is another development, thankfully. Within the time that we started the project 2 years ago, Ghana decided to have a Ghana commodity exchange for the sale of grains, rice, maize, and others on the stock exchange basis. Now, the commodity exchange is demanding a warehouse receipt system. So the Ghana Standards Authority, as we speak, has certified 15 warehouses for the supply of grains to the Ghana Commodity Exchange. So there is a market, there are interventions. So our job is made much easier, because if you want to supply to the Ghana Commodity Exchange, you must have a warehouse receipt system which is certified by the Standards Authority. We check for the moisture content, we check for the storage facilities, and yes, we also check in for aflatoxin and grading the grains to be sold. So here you have awareness creation driven by research, not just from Ghana, but from elsewhere, having a policy direction to having a warehouse or a commodity exchange. And this is linking straight to the market. So in a way, we feel but seriously blessed that the various issues have come together at a very good time to help us derive progress. Finally, we have started trading, that is Africa, on the African Continental Free Trade Area, quota-free, tariff-free across the 54 countries. And I believe these discussions we are having should feed into that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alex. Really interesting. I'll turn now to Rodwell, who I think in your earlier comments started to talk about the biofortification examples. And I think the audience would appreciate hearing more about kind of the status of biofortification policy, how you've managed to integrate this, and kind of challenges and the way ahead.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start by saying that we brought in biofortification into play because of some challenges in Malawi, such as stunting, some poor size issues. Of course, even literature has got it that cognitive challenges can also be associated with lack of some micronutrients in our food. So we had those challenges at heart, and then we thought of how can we reduce that and improve the health of our young ones. We had to think of maybe physically adding some micronutrients through buying them in shops and adding them to the food. But of course, the value chain sometimes can disappoint us. That's why we thought of maybe having biofortification to be the way for Malawi. So in that regard, you can agree with me that in our case, biofortification is a relatively new agricultural technology in Malawi, and it is nutrition sensitive agriculture evidence-based technology. We started some time back, but starting from 2007, this technology has been promoted through a number of actors in Malawi, and we are targeting 3 or 4 crops in Malawi. One, we are having vitamin A maize, high iron beans. We have also orange flavored fresh sweet potato or vitamin A sweet potato. And to a less extent, we are having vitamin A cassava in Malawi. But we should be very open with you that emphasis is on the first 3, though some efforts are there to promote cassava. We are not yet there in full force, but in terms of crops in Malawi which are getting some support are those 3 mainly, because cassava is under breeding and other things. So, for example, we are also involving other stakeholders, like Harvest Plus is assisting us to scaling up vitamin A maize. And we, on beans, have ABCCAT, and on the orange fresh sweet potato is CIP. IITA is also involved in breeding the cassava itself in Malawi. All these were possible because we had to allow the involvement of other players in the research, in the marketing, in the production, through relaxation of our policies, which were at that time in requiring only the agricultural research stations to be involved in this, and then government bodies were also to sell. For example, we have got Agriculture Marketing and Development Corporation, which is ADMAC, is used to be the channel through which all the technologies or crops were to be sold, but this one was relaxed. So, for example, on these 3 crops, for us to reach out to many communities, we had a number of, or we have a number of stakeholders engaged. For example, we've got CG centers involved, government involved, private sector, and government organizations, and even community-based organizations are all involved in the promotion of the biofortified crops. The 3 I was telling you, even the 4th one will be on the line. So currently, what we are doing in Malawi is that if we are to develop technology, for example, the technology of biofortified maize, beans, and sweet potato, the Department of Research in Malawi, in collaboration with Harvest Plus, had to have this bred, tested, and registered. And because of that, we know that government cannot be involved in the production of that. We also had to have an agreement or agreements with private sector seed companies in Malawi. So because of that, we have seen that we have produced a lot of seed through these seed companies, which have marketed these crops to farmers through agro dealers across the country. But we should also be mindful of the fact that the agro dealers themselves had to buy from somewhere. So processors. So the farmer is between the agro dealers and processors. So after producing the crop, the farmers are to sell to processors who are to process the fortified crops and then put them on the market. For example, we have had working with the community-based organizations and international organizations. We have got the school feeding program. Previously, we were importing the fortified food for this particular case and other consumers, but now the school feeding program is provided with biofortified maize, for example, to grow and use in the schools as porridge for the learners. We have seen, unfortunately, I'm coming from Minister of Education. I was there as a director. We have seen that this has been accepted wholly, and a lot of learners are attending now classes in large numbers. So by that alone, we are sure that we are providing the nutrient food to them to avoid cases of, for example, stunting in medium or long term, poor sight, and other ailments associated with the deficiencies of these three, that is vitamin A, iron, and sometimes even zinc. So in Malawi, we are also involving these market channels to absorb whatever is processed by our millers, and sometimes even the school communities grow maize on their own to feed the learners during the school feeding program. We have also seen that despite the food, children food, we have had confectionaries and breakfast cereals produced. Some of these were imported, but now they are produced locally. And we believe if we scale up more, we are to save on foreign exchange in Malawi. So Malawi, as it is rather, it is more of promoting new products, as I said, through biofortified maize, biofortified beans, biofortified sweet potatoes. I know that there was an issue of challenges, yes, challenges, because scalability would depend upon how we cover the country in terms of providing this. As of now, I think the scale is not that large, but we are in the drive of making sure that large population or large number of consumers are approached. So we are also scaling up the production on the seed market. On the seed company side, it's not a problem. On the agro dealer problem is not, agro dealer side is not much of the problem, but the farmers involved in production of this need to be increased so that the products should be reaching more and more stakeholders out there. We have observed that due to this technology, the results is that the supply of biofortified crops is increasing over time, and the participation by private sector as well as CSOs, community-based organizations, and non-governmental organization is increasing. And we are also sure that with this, we are slowly reducing the impacts of the deficiencies of vitamin A, iron, and other macro nutrients. We have also seen that farmers are very eager to participate in this, I think largely because we've had civic education through extension services to them. Yes, research can do far much better, but I think the transfer of knowledge from the research to farmers need to have a deliberate policy to make sure that they learn what it means and what are the advantages of that in their communities. So I think, as I already said, we are also saving somehow on foreign exchange in Malawi. We have learned a number of lessons that if government is there to be participating in partnership of scaling up or adopting the technology, definitely that technology is easily adopted and accepted. And then we have also seen that I think the private sector in Malawi are very, very eager to assist government. So these came about because there was deregulation or inclusion of this into the policy and sensitizing the targeted groups or the farmers, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, so that they were to be fully supportive of what we are doing in Malawi. In short, I think that is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rodwell. One quick follow-up for you that came in the chat while you were speaking, and I think it's something that comes up often with biofortification. So just wanted to give you a chance to quickly answer is the question of residual effects. And I assume this means on health, human health for biofortified products. So if you want to just talk about the status of research or the process you all do to assure food safety there. I know there's a lot of work that's been done on that, but give you the floor to answer.
You are cutting. Can you repeat? You were cutting. I could not get you clearly.
Yeah, the question was about residual effects of biofortified food. So I presume the question means on human health. So just wanted to give you the opportunity to give a brief reason why biofortified products are still supported and their impacts on human health.
We are working in partnership with Ministry of Health, for example, which every now and again have to look at what is happening around. They have to work together with our seed companies to see what the product is coming out of them. And even the processors, sometimes our Malawi Bureau of Standards are always checking on them to see what can be the residual effect of that particular product. Of course, I may not clearly say it now because we are in the process of developing and scaling up of the technology, but we believe that with the involvement of Ministry of Health and other international organizations, we are likely to have the checks and balances on what is happening regarding the human health. So that can be temporarily the answer to the question.
Great, thank you very much. My last question for our panelist is for Yosuke. And part of the question is around financing the investment of innovations and what are the opportunities for companies and even individual farmers to access concessional or blended finance. And one question that came through in the registration that I think is related to this, Yosuke, is how does an organization like IFC think about investment in the CapEx or OpEx for a new technology that's risky or unproven? So in those really early stages of new technology commercialization in emerging markets, what are some of the options for finance for both farmers and firms?
Okay, thank you so much. So let me first start with like a blended finance because it's getting a really powerful tool. And I'm really happy that last 5 to 7 years, you know, this financing method through blended finance is pretty well established and well tested, you know, like a subordinated tranche or first loss or lower interest rate and all that. And it's a bit like a, you know, smart subsidy that Rodrigo mentioned, right? It will kind of phase out as project de-risks. And then the one thing I just want to highlight is probably blended finance typically address incremental risk. So for example, like a payback is a bit longer than usual. Or let's say if banker like us can take like up to 3 key risks we can swallow, and then there are 4th risk and 5th risk, maybe it's time to bring in blended finance. So the basic bankability has to be there. So like a decent confidence on the market demand or proof of concept or, you know, experienced sponsor, those factors has to be still there. And so we financed like a couple of like fairly early stage projects through, you know, leveraging on blended finance. So one example is Pearl Dairy in Uganda. So today it's really large dairy company, even exporting. But when we came in like, you know, 5-6 years ago, it was more like, that was when they are establishing the plant and people kind of knew Uganda is a good place for dairy, but not many people had really tested at the scale. So we came in with blended finance and then we brought in advisory services, worked with companies, extension officers together to help farmers' productivity, right? So those tools are there. And then for like a really new technology startup, so so we have like a venture capital team who invest in like a ag tech space. So if there's a really scalability, and I don't think we can come in at really seed round or Series A, but if it's like a Series B, C, D, like if there's a decent kind of a minimum viable product and business has like a kind of a trajectory to really scale, that's probably the timing where our VC colleagues could start looking. And also another tool we recently got is something called Upstream. So Upstream is like a kind of a new department within IFC who can actually co-finance good pilots that could really scale and then become a game changer. So actually it's pretty new team. So we're seeing how it is ramping up and how it goes, but we have that tool. And also, as a sister company of the World Bank, more and more collaboration with World Bank is ongoing on kind of shaping better policy or appropriate regulation and all that. And lastly, how we can touch farmers. So actually, so we still have to continue to partner with, various African banks who have more rural branches and farmer network, or even more with like a microfinance institutions. So we collaborate with them, like we participate on their portfolio, and then on the side we provide advisory services. And then so it's more like a trickle down, or we can invest in like a core company, and then along that supply chain farmer will also flourish. So some companies actually provide pre-finance like inputs and then off-take the crop, or those things will happen. And if we provide financing, we encourage the company to scale up those programs. So hopefully that will trickle down to smallholders. So yeah, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Yosuke. So that brings me to the end of my kind of prepared questions for the panelists. I see one in the chat that I think I can open up to the floor. And if others of you have other questions you're thinking of, feel free to write them there. The questions, it's two questions, and I'll try and kind of combine them into one from Josie Franceschini, really about how the public sector can be more involved with the private sector in the sense of getting involved in the formal seed value chains, whether that be through licensing arrangements or royalty agreements, given that we know public funding for research is always quite constrained, and yet we rely on these institutions to provide solutions for food security. How can we create more mechanisms that allow public research to be commercialized, or at least be more involved in the commercial chain? So I don't know if one of our government colleagues wants to take that on, but I'll open it up to the floor for the panelists to respond to.
This is Ndidi. I can actually get started.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so I really think that every single research institution in Africa should have a private sector advisory board that helps determine what their research agenda is and also helps with funding. If our research institutions are working on interventions that are demand-driven, that meet the needs and address the needs of private sector organizations, we will fund them. We will fund the research, as is done in many other parts of the world. And the reality is that a lot of the research that's done by national research institutions is not demand-driven and is donor-driven or is driven by the international research institutions. And this is a big frustration for the private sector. So I would really push for that institutional change, where at least 50% of the research agenda is shaped by what the private sector needs, and you can prioritize it. The second is our research institutions need newsletters that they send to the private sector. I can assure you that most private sector organizations do not know about the great research that's being done. And so even that commercialization cannot happen. And Sahel Consulting has been bridging that gap. We're doing that in the yam seed systems, the cassava seed systems, and the dairy value chain, even in rice and maize. And what we realize is that there's so much ignorance out there about what is going on in the research institutions. We continue to operate in silos in the African context. And then the third role is what I talked about, the role of the media. Now, what government can do, government funds a lot of these these research institutions. We need to streamline them, we need to strengthen them, and we need to make them more forward-thinking and outward-looking. And I mean, it will change the nature of these organizations, but if you can't communicate what you're doing, how can it be embraced? How can it be influenced, and how can private sector get involved in funding the good work that you do? So that's my one key pet peeve. And then from a public sector perspective, I would also like to add that for me, I think commercialization involves a lot of testing. Now, testing is expensive. People don't want to publicize bad news and failures, especially in our context. And that's why we need a cross-sector collaboration. We need organizations that are willing to say, here, test on my farm or test in my company. And many private companies are willing to offer that support to you, but you need to ask, and you need to build that bridge between the two entities and almost two worlds. Thank you.
Thanks, Ndidi. I think it's a great answer, and the comments in the chat are reflecting, I think, broad support for your idea to make private sector advisory boards and outward-looking and forward-thinking research centers. I know it's something that at the Gates Foundation, when we set up the grant to IITA to commercialize Aflasafe, it was part of this, how can we think through the end market distribution of this good research early on in the process? And so it's an experience those organizations have had. We're getting close on the time of this panel, but if any government counterpart wanted to respond to that from the government side, we can take one last comment and then we'll turn it back over to the organizers to.
Okay, thank you. If I may. Sorry, maybe Alex can go first.
Oh, I mean, Peter, I was just going to say one thing, that the issue of testing cannot be left to the private sector alone, and we need a discussion on how government can meet them somehow. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that Kenya Agricultural Livestock Research Organization has been involved actually in this promotion of the Aflasafe. And also Kenya Bureau of Standards is also involved in various research activities. So I think and collaborating also with the universities. So I think it's an area, of course, as Ndindi has mentioned, we need to widen the collaboration with the private sector and also with the media. These are ideas which can be tapped into and also included in the various intervention measures for policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I will bring us to a close here and just end with my thanks for the 6 panelists that we've just heard from. Also our keynote speaker, Dr. Chianu. I think really interesting insights building off of some of the conversations we've had as a community on scaling at AGRF and some other forums recently. So thank you to the organizers. And with that, I will turn it over to Marcella to give us some closing remarks.
Thank you. I just want to echo thanks to all of the panelists and keynote speaker for joining us today and providing their thoughts. And big thank you to Garen as well for facilitating such an excellent panel. I thought that this was a great discussion and really complemented the discussions yesterday when we heard from the private sector perspective and then had those breakout sessions. I think that at least, I said it in the Aflasafe breakout session, for instance, and I think many of the topics that we covered in that breakout session were really reiterated here today by our government partners and by folks working on the financing aspects. So thanks to everyone for bringing out some great points and a really rich discussion. This concludes day 2 of our 3-day webinar series. And just to give a little plug and preview for tomorrow. So tomorrow really focuses on looking forward. As I said earlier, we wanted to kind of set the foundation on the first day, introduce the technologies, and really set the stage, hear from private sector about their experiences scaling these technologies. Today, continued our look at lessons learned and what's worked well and what's been challenging in the scaling journey of these technologies from the perspective of the enabling environment. And with day 3, we wanted to really take those lessons and look forward and consider how our stakeholders and donors and others working in this space thinking about incorporating these lessons in their work around scaling and commercialization in the future. And how are we thinking about the future of food systems and really the role of commercialization as we build technologies and solutions that will be relevant for future food systems and allow small farmers to be included in that journey. So would welcome you all to join us at the same time here tomorrow. And thank you again to our facilitator, to our panelists, to our keynote speaker. Huge thank you to the IITA team as well for all of the work to organize and make sure that this discussion could go smoothly. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.